Welcome to the Terry College edition of Why or Why Not with the Watsons. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Benjamin as he was a standout football player at the University of Georgia. Went on to be a first-round NFL draft pick and both played in and won a Super Bowl. You may also know Kirsten, who is also a Terry and Institute for Leadership Advancement graduate and budding author. Earlier this year, the couple launched their latest project, a podcast also entitled Why or Why Not with the Watsons. It is great to have two outstanding alumni with us this afternoon, willing to share their thoughts and ideas with us. This program allows us to stay connected with our alumni in a time where we can't gather in person and we're not hosting our regular programs like Tier Through Thursday or the Professional Women's Conference or other opportunities where our alumni are getting together. So we're thrilled to be able to offer this afternoon. A little bit of housekeeping. During the session, the Q&A box will be live throughout the program. So please utilize this tool as we will do our best to address your questions toward the end of the program. We do plan to conclude by 2:15. So with that, let's go ahead and I'll let Benjamin and Kirsten take it away. Thank you both for joining us.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Dean Harris. It's always good to connect back with Georgia. We've been gone for feels like a long time. So anytime we have an opportunity to do anything with the university, other than jump up and down in our living room and run around in circles watching football games and sometimes pull our hair out, we always jump at the opportunity. So it is great to be with you all virtually. I'm glad we were able to, still be involved, even though we're in a season where there's so much going on, technology-wise. It allows us to stay connected.
Definitely. So we are here to talk about a lot of things, but this is called Why or Why Not with the Watsons. So why is it called that? Where did this podcast thing come into play?
Well, I'm why.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes back to our days in Athens.
Mm-hmm.
So for those, some of you may have known us back in college. So many of our college friends say, I can't believe you guys are married. Can't believe y'all stayed married for 15 years. Can't believe you got 7 kids. Like, y'all argued all the time. And that is very, very true. I'm why, because I was, a finance major, and finance people are black and white. We got to know what's the reason that I should take this risk, because I really don't want to take this risk if I can't quantify how it's going to help me out. Kirsten was in my finance class cheating on me.
This is so untrue. Okay, I am why not. Marketing major, sales, I can help you understand why this is a good idea, why this is a good deal. So from the beginning, we've looked at things very differently. So this podcast was really nothing that was new. It was just always how we've been. So like we said, we met in Georgia. It was his year transferring from Duke, and it was my second year, sophomore year. We were both sophomores, and the rest is history. Now we've been married 15 years. And we have 7 kids, which are all here right now. So thank you for having us, because this is like our date afternoon of an hour without having to answer any questions.
And also hopefully the internet stays well, because we're in Boston, Massachusetts. So there's actually snow on the ground outside. Mm-hmm. And all the kids are doing virtual school. So the internet is taxed every single day. But yes, this is a special time for us to kind of be away from them for a little bit and join with you. So our podcast, Why or Why Not, in Why or Why Not with the Watsons, we talk about parenting. We talk a lot about marriage, kind of the ups and downs, things we've gone through. We've been through about 5 different moves, cross-country moves with the entire house and all the kids, kind of with my football career. And we also talk a lot about, dealing with cultural issues. How do you talk to your kids about things like bullying or race or something that they saw on TV? How do you talk to them about sex and dating that's coming? I mean, our oldest is only 11, but there are some things coming down the pipe for us that we kind of want to open that line of communication. And so it's just our way, I think, of telling a little bit of our story, but also empowering and encouraging parents, husbands, wives, to moms, dads, to just engage with their children and also to engage in the culture on the issues of our day. And so that's why we're here.
Right. So we mentioned 7 kids. So just for some reference of how old they are, we have an 11-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, and our twins are 19 months old. So we kind of have everybody in elementary, like all the grades covered, and a middle schooler. So we have a lot of conversations, like Benjamin said, around a lot of different topics. Understand that we have to kind of meet the 5-year-old where they are and our 11-year-old where they are. And so what we realized was a lot of the conversations that we were having amongst our families are very similar to the ones that we should be having as adults, in terms of learning how to respect how people think differently, people's perspectives, how one person can see the same toy being snatched, but the stories around why that happened are very different. And so I think that the podcast helps with that also, for adults to be open to having conversations around tough topics, and being comfortable. And so hopefully the idea is that we're helping our kids learn how to manage these situations, to be able to understand their perspective and understand their truth, but also be able to engage and have a conversation of someone who thinks completely differently than they do. And so as adults, we need to be able to set an example and obviously be able to do the very same thing.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I did enjoy. I know most of you hopefully had positive experiences in Athens, but one of the things that I did enjoy about that time was, especially being on a football team, was being around a bunch of different guys who are the same age, who come from different backgrounds, who have different understandings of the way the world works. But because we love each other, because we have these shared life experiences with each other, we're able to have those tough conversations, or courageous conversations, what I like to call them, about issues that are happening. It's been the same way for me throughout my athletic career in the NFL, being around those guys. We don't always agree, but unlike what I see sometimes in the outside world, we're able to deal with something very tough, like we've dealt with in 2020, when it comes to a pandemic, when it comes to a racial reckoning, when it comes to economic upheaval, all these sorts of, an election. Let's not forget about the election. The election, and we're able to have some of these conversations that are tough, but then we go out and we go work together. We love each other. We work toward a common goal because we can respect our differences. Same way in marriage. Now, we don't always get along. I know, as beautiful as she is, you think I would always get along with her, but I don't. That's why our friends are always like, how did y'all stay married? Because y'all argued all the time. But even in close relationships, it's imperative that we're able to have these types of discussions. And so that's what we're hoping this short time we have with you all is going to be. We have a connection with you all because we all are Bulldogs. We all are Terry alum, more specifically. And although we are in different places around the country right now, we're in different places in our lives, possibly different occupations, different, you name it. The safe place should be amongst people that you have some sort of understanding with, and therefore some sort of common respect in engaging on these issues.
Agreed. So we're going to talk about race. Take a breath. It's one of those things where I say, you know, when we say, or someone says race, or we're going to talk about race, especially this past year, you just take an inventory of what that makes you feel like. Obviously, you knew that before we were coming up, before you joined, and so you're kind of somewhat prepared, but just really, it's about first recognizing what that stirs up for you. And then being okay with that and say, okay, well, let me take a breath and let me engage. Because I think part of the conversation, what we want to have, and that we hope that you're having and will continue to have, is allowing the space to see differently. It's allowing the space to hear differently. It's allowing the space to not feel attacked, but feel as though you can bring something or learn something from the conversation. I think we do that in pretty much every other area of our lives, or many areas of our lives. If we say, hey, we're going to do a parenting conference, or we're going to do a how to be a better leader at your job, you know, you'd come in thinking, I don't know everything. So I'm hoping that I'm taking something back that I can become better in XYZ area. Well, our hope is that as we talk about race, that this be no different. This is not something that, you know, is so specialized that you just will never understand. It's so, you know, small and whatever, that it's just something, it's a hands-off situation. So we hope that you enter into this in a way that allows you just to engage and to learn and to listen and to understand that we're all coming to this situation or this conversation with our own experiences, with our own perspectives. And that's great. But hey, maybe there's another one out there. And maybe I can listen and understand and learn more so that hopefully we all walk away with this with some nuggets of how we can be better citizens, how we can be better parents, better people, better employers and better employees, just in how we communicate with each other and people that are different.
Yeah, so we're kind of tying it back to the why or why not. The idea is, okay, why? Why should I even talk about this?
Right.
And I know that for some people, it's why? Why talk about something that, for me, sometimes I feel like it's never going to change. I feel like we're in this rut right now. I look back, I wrote about this in my book, Under Our Skin. I wrote about the fact that it seems like the same things that our grandparents told us about, we're seeing a lot of those same things happen over and over again. So why even have a discussion about something that is taking so long to correct? On the other side, you may be saying, well, why not? Why not take the risk? Why not get out of my comfort zone? Why not try to strategize and figure out singular ways as individuals and as collectives, as organizations, we can get better? Right. And why should we do that? What do we benefit from even doing this? And so there's two sides to this, as Kirsten said, and there's sometimes a clash there, but we can't deny the place where we are. Right. When you look at where we are and you look over the last year, this year was unlike any other, I would say, that I've been alive. Now, look, I'm not super old, although my birthday is coming up, about to be 40 years old. Yeah. We're going skiing, but I don't know where. It's a surprise. So if you know, don't tell me. But if you look over this year, it's been like any other, especially when you think about just the images that we've seen. And when you think about seeing George Floyd in Minnesota, you think about Ahmaud Arbery down in Brunswick, Georgia. I mean, seeing him running through the streets, seeing, him being shot, all those sorts of things. You think about, the people that were protesting afterwards on June 6th this year. On June 6th, which was one day, 500,000 people protested in the streets in 500 different locations in America. This year was, by all accounts, the largest movement of that sort that we've ever seen in this country. And it wasn't just a certain type of person. There were Black people, there were white people, there were rich, there were poor, there were educated. I mean, it didn't matter. Because we were all sitting in our homes and because of what we saw on our iPhones or on the television set or on our computers, we felt like we had to get out and do something, and we had to have our voices be heard. Right.
And so I think when we think about race, a good place to start is obviously the present and where we are now, but we always need to reflect on the past. And I know for some, it's like, oh, we got to go back to slavery. Well, it's kind of like, you have to understand that some things are habitual. They keep happening. It's a different year. And at some point, everything is the past. Whatever happened at lunch that I just gave my kids, that's the past. And so guess what? Lunch will happen again tomorrow, prayerfully, and that's the future. And so even though it seems as though some people we want to talk about George Floyd, we want to talk about it, and that just, or we want to talk about, let's say you're in a conversation, someone wants to go back to the civil rights movement, like, gosh, can we just get over it? Like we got, it's understanding what happened then. So because that shapes how we view how things are happening now. It's just an important point, and such an important point to remember that the past is very important, not to belabor it, but to understand it, to acknowledge it, to see how all the points connect together that help influence and impact where we are today, because that's the only way, honestly, that we will be able to impact and change the future. It's about breaking habits. It's about understanding why we think the way we think, so that way we can make it better. And I mean, granted, there are some areas when it comes to race that we are better.
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
There are some things that my mom and my dad experienced that, have been different for us and that will be different for our kids. But there are some things that are systematic or that are kind of ingrained that are very similar. So that when I tell my mom something that happened, she's like, yeah, I remember when that happened. And my grandmother, who just passed 2 months ago, would say the same thing. So some things have continued. We're talking about my grandparents. So we're not talking about the 1800s, right? We're not talking about something that seems like, well, I wasn't there. It's like, just ask your parents, just ask your grandparents, like what they experienced when it came to race. And the stories that you'll hear will maybe help you understand where we are today.
Yeah, any problem that you want to address, you have to have the full spectrum and the full perspective. It's been like that. I'll go back to football again because that's what I've been doing. But even in football, you look at film. Like right now, Kirby, the team, they're looking at film of the last week. They're looking at film actually of last year when they played the team they're going to play. Mm-hmm. They'll actually look at film probably of 5 years ago, and they might actually look at that one coach that they're playing against. If he coached somewhere else, they'll look at what that guy did defensively and offensively at another place at another time to get an idea of how to attack the present. Mm-hmm. And so when you go into a situation like this that is very emotionally charged, there's a lot of hurt there. There's a lot of narratives that are thrown around, many of them untrue. It seems that, right now it's either way to the left or way to the right in order for you to get any clicks. The truth is somewhere in the middle. It's important that we're able to understand history. And when we talk about history from a racial standpoint, we don't have to go back to the 1800s. You can talk about things like redlining. You can talk about things like the racial wealth gap, which right now, even in 2020, is 10 to 1 when you talk about the net worth of the average Black family versus the average white family. Now, you may be saying, well, I'm not rich. Well, the average is $171,000 of net worth for the white family, $17,000 for the Black family. That hasn't changed in half a century. And so when you hear those types of numbers, while there are some great things that have happened, the reality of it is that when you see a summer like we've had and you see people have this outpouring, it's not simply about that one incident.
Yeah.
It's about a litany of other things that have happened, a litany of other traumas that have happened that have yet to be fully addressed and maybe fully even recognized. As a country, we talk about history all the time. We celebrate the 4th of July. We celebrate Independence Day. We celebrate Declaration of Independence. We talk about all these things. So we are, as people, we are historical.
Right. Yeah.
What happens sometimes is that when it's something that we don't want to think about, we tend to not be historical about that and only think about the present. And what we found is that in any situation that you want to have an understanding of something fully and grasp exactly what's happening, you have to be willing to step into the good part of the history and the bad part of the history. On all sides, there has to be a certain honesty there, and quite frankly, that's what we learn it. That's how we learn in institutions of learning. Mm-hmm. You look at it, from a full spectrum in order to move forward.
So when we talk about race, we mentioned earlier the conversations that we have with our kids around race. You may be thinking, okay, what do I do? On a lot of different levels. But we're going to first talk about what can you actually do in your home? What can you do yourself to make sure or to have this conversation around race, one that is truthful, right? And two, that encourages a lot of different perspectives. What are some of the things that you can do, or can you do anything at home? And the answer is a very loud yes. And again, I have to keep going back to this point because I think it's a valid one, in that if there was something in your life that you wanted to get better in, you would Google it in 5 seconds. You could have Amazon ship you the books in 24 hours, maybe 48.
Amazon is at our house all the time.
That is not what I'm talking about.
I call her Queen Nazoma. That's Amazon spelled backwards, because Amazon is always here.
Okay, this is true.
That was a side note.
Side note. You can see this is how we are. But the point is, if there was anything in your life where you wanted to get better, we are a community and culture that wants what we want. We want to learn it. We want to have it. If I see it, I will buy it. That's the culture that we live in. And guess what? I want it in less than 24, 48 hours max. Do not make me wait a week. So when it comes to this issue around race and learning about it, it amazes me how many people are just like, I just have no idea where to start. And I'm like, well, just Google something. I don't know. I'm saying that in a way that's super loving, but super serious. There are things that you can do. There are articles you can read. There are books that you can read. There are podcasts that you can listen to. There's YouTube channels that would help you get a more rounded look of what race is in America, the history of it. So there are definitely resources out there that we will provide. It's definitely at the end of this talk that may help you get started. Books that he's written or that we read or that we recommend for you just to kind of get your foot in the water. It's like talking about things. And so I think first it's about educating yourself, because if you go in and you're having a conversation around race, there are definitely some words that you want to understand. You want to understand why you think the way you think. And I think that individually, the work that we have to do around race, I'm gonna say, especially if you're not Black, okay? The individual work is very tough. Why? Because I always, when I'm having these conversations, I say, let's think back to the time where you first heard a joke about a Black person, a story that was negative about a Black person, anything that, you know, called a different name, any innuendo to something that you normally this happens when you're a child, that you're like, like that's a different way to look at this group of people. And from that first experience, you learned how to maneuver in life, like how to not say certain things or say certain things around certain groups, or just have this kind of conversation that only happens in your home or only happens at this person's house. And that takes courage, because we realize that, you know, a lot of what I get sometimes is like, you know, Kirsten, I'm not racist. Like I see people as they are. I don't see color. You know, we don't teach that in our home. And it's like, okay, well, first of all, I need you to see color because I am Black. And you see color because you got dressed this morning and hopefully you're matching. So it's not a matter of not seeing color. We want you to see color because we're all created that way. But individually, we want you to understand it's when we put value to those colors that makes a difference. And that's what we've done with any group. You know, like we have these like kind of stereotypes around certain groups, and even these good stereotypes are like, you know, these people are smart, or these people are athletic, or these good, they're all stereotypes and they're all bad. So we have to uncover individually and do the work individually to say, you know, where did that come from? Like, where did I learn that from and why? And how has this been reinforced? Subtle. It's nothing that's not very overt. It's very subtle. In my conscious of how, like, you know, what am I listening to? Like, who am I watching on TV? What little things are happening that have brought me to this place where I see this value difference when it comes to race? And so are there things that you can do at home? The first thing we would encourage you is to start with yourself. Start with yourself by having an honest conversation of, what do I actually think about people who are different than me? Not the church answer, not the Southern polite answer, no, we're all the same, and that's great. But no, I'm talking the individual, closed door, you're the only one there, and really sit there and start peeling back the onion. Because when we do that as individuals, that is what helps to impact our communities. That is what helps to impact our families. When we can individually find out what those are, address them, and then hopefully change them when needed.
Yeah, and you mentioned the onion. When you peel back the onion, sometimes it makes you cry. Mm-hmm. And this year, I think, has made a lot of us cry. And not just this year, but 5 years before and a year before, and we're going to cry in the future too. And I think that before you even get to what Kirsten's talking about having that conversation with yourself and even educating yourself and peeling back that onion, you have to cry. Mm-hmm. And you have to lament. You know, lamentation is about sorrow, it's about mourning, it's about empathy, all those sorts of things when someone or an entity or a group is suffering. As a nation, we've suffered in a bunch of different ways. This year specifically, and when we look at those who have been hurt and those who are crying out, people have died for various reasons, it's about lament. It's about, maybe this didn't happen to me, but anytime someone is suffering some sort of injustice, real or perceived, anytime someone is suffering from being treated badly, we should be people who care and lament with them. So number one is, this woman lost her child. I don't care what he did or what he didn't do. Mm-hmm. I feel bad because a life is lost. That puts you in a proper place, I think, to be willing to have that conversation with yourself and willing to start peeling back that onion. And the thing about the onion is, I'm not a chef. I do like to eat. She does a great job. But when I have cut onions or peeled back onions, you cry, they kind of stink, they smell kind of funny, but the onions is what makes the dish perfect. Yeah. It's what takes it over the top. And so there is hope in this lamentation and this education, is that, okay, if we start peeling these things back more and more and more and more, it's going to get ugly. It's going to make you cry. You're not really going to know what to do with all this. But eventually the hope and really the promise on paper of America is of this place where you put all this stuff back together and you have this beautiful aroma and this dish that we can all be proud of.
Yeah, it's good.
So the lamentation, I think, is part of that learning. And that learning, like Kirsten said, the next step is reading some books, having some conversations, watching some DVD. We're going to provide some resources, just a few resources. These are by no means exhaustive, and it's just a couple of ideas and things that we've done to learn, because there's an educational process that comes for me being a Black man as well. There are a lot of things that I haven't been taught about my own culture. There are a lot of things that have been controlled, that have been taken out. A lot of things that I'm discovering all the time to be really, really proud of, and some not so. But it helps me put together the pieces of what I'm seeing currently when I understand what the past is. And so, those books or those pieces of like Kirsten said, if there's anything that you want to know, you will spend the time to do it. We can always tell what's important to somebody by looking at their checkbook. Yeah. That's one thing. Looking at their time log, where they spend their time, where they spend their talent. I don't care what you say about anything. Look at your checkbook, look where you spend your time. I can tell you what's important to you. If this is going to be important, then it's going to have to show up with some evidence.
That's right. And I would just be cautious of, again, like I said, take a breath when we started this. So if you at any moment right now are feeling like, okay, but what about this, Kirsten, or what about this, Benjamin? Like if you are
put it in the chat, put it in the questions.
Yeah, put it in the questions for sure. But also just realize that like the rebuttal part is the part that I want to ask you just to kind of tame for a second, because it breaks your ability to hear what is being said. Like when we are having this conversation, it is not to attack, obviously. It's to help engage in conversation. And so it's kind of like if you were to have an argument or discussion with your spouse or someone that you're really close to where you can just be super real. It's like sometimes you don't even hear what the person is saying because you are already formulating your rebuttal. You are already saying, but what about that time when da 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 da, or when you did this, or when you, and so you're not even really engaging. You're just ready to attack. And so this topic of race is very difficult. It's very difficult to listen because you already, like I said, we're coming to the table with our own perceptions. We're coming to the table where it's like, I want to believe you, but this, but that. Well, what about, I mean, I'm sure it's going to come up at some point. What about Black Lives Matter? I would be on, it's like, just sit on it, put in chat. But the whole point is that if we really want to have engaging conversation, those comments, those questions will be answered the more we're able to listen. And I think that being at home in 2020, it has become very polarizing, and it's become very difficult to have these conversations because everybody's in their tribe. You're in this tribe, I'm in this tribe, and guess what? Everybody in that tribe is X, Y, and Z. Now, that's not really fair, because you're probably not X, maybe you're Y in that tribe, but you're not X, Y, and Z, And so it helps when we can have a conversation, takes people out of tribes and into individuals. And that's what we really want to help facilitate the conversation around your thoughts, not your tribe or my tribe, but just saying like, let's have an engaging conversation. So I just want to say that because we've said a lot. And obviously we're not having a conversation back and forth immediately right now. Hopefully you'll put your questions in the chat. But I just encourage you, even as you're hearing this, I can feel some tensions may rise because this is a very hot topic. It's a very heated topic. So again, what are things that we can do? We talked about individually, where to start. We're going to provide some resources. But then we also think that, what are we passing on? I think this part is very important because
legacy.
It's a legacy. And so for some of us, when we think about that first time we heard the joke or first time we heard a comment, and we may think we aren't that way. Well, I'm not like my grandmother, or I'm not like my cousin or my aunt or my uncle or whoever. So I don't think that way. But there are some things that we pass on without saying a word to our kids. If we're watching the news and something comes on, like how we react to it, are we sighing? Are we rolling our eyes? Are we amening? Are we, what are we doing? And they are watching that. They are watching how we, so they may not understand a conversation, but they can understand tone, they can see gestures. And so even without saying something, we can always be passing something on. And I think that's one thing Benjamin and I have to be very careful of, because although we have a history and we have experiences around race, our kids haven't had that in some situations. And so we don't want to pass on any negativity or, just perpetuating anything either. So it's everybody's responsibility to be mindful of how we educate without formally educating our kids. And a lot of education happens in the home. And so I always say other things that people say, well, what else can I do for my kids? I'm like, okay, well, let's look, if you have a daughter or a son, let's look at their toys. Okay, let's look at their Barbies. Let's look at their dolls. Does everyone look like you? Is there any diversity in the books and your bookcase for your kids? Like the things that you're reading, are any of the protagonists people that don't look like you? I think about other things that we do. It's like we always get the markers that give you like all the colors in there. So they're not, everyone's not.
We got Band-Aids now too.
We have the Band-Aids that are all the
Brown
colors.
Band-Aids.
It's like, so, and our kids don't even say black and white. They call people peach and brown, because very young with our first, I said, well, what color do you see? Grace, when you look in there, she says, well, I see brown. I was like, okay, well, call it what you see. And so our kids refer to people as peach and brown and light, darker peach or tan, or, they have this whole spectrum of how they describe people. But the same thing happens when they color. When they color people, everyone's not brown. They're all different. Mommy's a different shade and daddy's a different, so they're able to recognize that people are different. And so again, it goes back to saying people were made different. We're believers. So we say, God made us different. That's beautiful. But again, it's like, but there's no value to being better or being worse because of how you were made. And so when it comes to your kids, you don't have to make a big deal about it. We do some stuff that's, centered around, race or like around Black Americans that have contributed to the United States. And we do certain things they learn about different people other than
taking different places.
Yeah, take them different places. So we do things so that they're able to be educated. But like Benjamin mentioned, there's a lot of stuff we weren't taught. And so we just try to be one day ahead.
Don't got to be an expert.
Don't be an expert. Just be one day ahead. So I just read ahead who we're going to be talking about, and then we present it to them. And so we just make sure we know. And guess what? It's a great teachable moment when they're like, well, Mommy, what about this? Or why is this that way? Or Daddy, why is this? And we don't know. So we go find out together. So it's not that you have to be an expert to your children, but it is the fact that we are modeling behaviors. I had a white friend who said to me, well, Kirsten, we just don't talk about race because that's just not the thing you talk about. And I was like, well, as your friend, as your Black friend, I need you to talk about race.
But even the fact that she's able to say that.
Right.
Because there are some things that we can't not talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have to prepare my children for when the peach and brown has value attached to it and they go into the world.
Right.
And so even in the conversation, I'll let you tell the story, even the conversation you had with your friend, it was about letting her see that it's even a privilege to not be able or not have to talk about it, that other people sometimes don't have that. But we need you.
Right.
We need everyone to talk about it because at some point.
Right. At some point, I'd say, to be frank, it's like I need, the same way we'll have a conversation with our kids when they start driving about the police, about how to encounter police if they're pulled over. If your white kid is in the car with my kid, or if your white kid is driving, I need them to understand what's going on or what's perceived to be going on, so they have some knowledge of what could happen, or, just whatever. It's like, I just need them to understand that there are people that think differently that do have value on race. And because of that, the way my kid will maneuver through the world will be different. And so if your kid is friends with my kid, they've got to understand that. So that way, if anything does happen, they're aware, and they know, because there are situations, I always say, the first time you're called the wrong name, the N-word, it's like, I need your kid to know that that's inappropriate, that the joke is inappropriate, to be called that is inappropriate. So they will speak up. Because in that moment, you literally have no words. As talkative as I am, it's just, thank you. As in that moment, like there's no words. And how awesome would it be for other families, white families, to have had the conversation that this is not a joke, it's not acceptable, that they can speak into that situation. So this is why, like Benjamin said, it's a privilege to not ever have to talk. I mean, you could not have any diverse babies or diverse books, and but it's just to have that is a great privilege that my family does not have, but it doesn't. It just makes everything better when your kids see it and they see it as normal, and they see it as something that can be embraced.
Yeah. All right. Along that legacy conversation, our children are, and when I say our children, don't just mean, our 7, but all the children represented by all of you, they are our postcard to the future. They're going to go places where you may never go. Mm-hmm. They're going to see things you may never see. They're going to create an impact with a generation of people that probably will not even know who you are or care who you are. And so when you think about it like that, when it comes to many issues, but when it comes to this issue, how are we being intentional as parents and honest as parents with what we see and what they see and what they hear and see coming out of our mouth and the expressions that we make on our faces, the small comments that we make. And that's all of us on a lot of different things. We make comments that our kids pick up. Like I said, our kids are young, but we're just realizing, wow, they pick up everything. I mean, when did you hear me say that? Right. But they hear things and they file it away. Mm-hmm. And if you're not aware as a parent or as a caretaker, and you're not willing to repent sometimes of what you've done wrong and be honest and say, when I said that or when I did that, I don't want you to think that way. Mm-hmm. I've thought that way before. I want you to have a different mindset about that. Then those things will continue on and on and on. And our kids will be sitting here after they went to University of Georgia and having these same conversations that we're having right now. And so that legacy piece, I think, is something that drives us, because it's not just going to happen. Mm-hmm. It's not just going to happen. We have to be intentional with our children.
For sure. Okay, I have a question. One question I sometimes get is, does age matter when it comes to talking about race? It's like, I don't want to tell them about slavery or about the bad things that happen to Black people because I think they're too young. And so, again, it's one of those things, it's the conversation of just having the truth. It's the same thing we would say if we were saying, when you talk to your kid, when do you introduce sex to your kids? It's like, we don't want to take away this innocence that they may have, that the world is this bright, cherry, sunny, everything goes right kind of place. And I understand that we want to protect our children. We want them to stay young as possible. But again, we're just giving the facts. And so I think, again, it's about putting the value of it. It's like, this is what happened in America. Here's the history of what happened. Here's what happened as a result. You just kind of go down the timeline. Say, so here we are, and this is when we'll say, like, yeah, Mimi and Papa were born, or, Granny and G-Daddy were born when this happened, or this is right before so they have a timeline to realize that we're talking about the civil rights, when we're talking about, separated water fountains, like, yeah, great, they call their great grandmother Gigi. Gigi was alive, it's like, so they're like, okay, so that really was not that long. It wasn't like, they're like, is it black and white?
They think I was born in like 18 something. Were you born in the black and white days?
No, we weren't born, but it helps them to kind of put some context around when things happened. And so we always relate to family members to help even the 5-year-old. Yeah, remember Gigi? Yeah, Gigi, this is when Gigi's born. Oh, this is when Mimi was born. This is when, whatever. Mommy and Dad, 1980s. Mommy and Daddy were alive when this happened. And so it helps give them context to the facts. And again, it's like staying ahead by one day with what those facts are. And I don't think when we're giving truth to our kids that it makes them, in this sense, it makes them see people differently. You can kind of see with our kids when they realize that, yeah, the school that you go to now, like, you wouldn't be allowed to go. And they, there's this moment of silence, like, just because I was brown? And I'm like, yeah. And so it's just the realization of how far we've come, and that they can be grateful for the opportunities that they have to go now. And yes, there were people that look like us and people who were peach, who worked together to make this difference. It helps to encourage them that we can work together. We can move these things forward and go to a different place.
Yeah, and I think that, it's about not only our children, but for all of us, it's relearning how to think. and learning how to think in some sort of nuance when we see things that are happening. We are so quick to, judge another by their worst examples, but then reserve and change that judgment when it comes to us. And so being able to see and ask the question, why? Why? Why not? But why? Why are these things happening? What's underneath? What's the underlying issue? It's usually not what you see or what you hear. There's usually something else beyond that. And getting to that, in my book, Under Our Skin, I wrote about the idea of both and. Like, more than one thing can be true. Yeah. At the same time, more than one thing, as unpopular as that sounds, right. At least that's what I learned in college in critical thinking. Like, more than one thing can be true at the same time, but that doesn't play well on cable news. Right. That doesn't sell well for campaign slogans. None of those things. Not thinking about both and creates more and more division. Yeah. And I want to read this part real quick. I don't know if I even told Kirsten that I told her I was going to do this.
Why not?
But why not? And in the book, I wrote this book after what happened in Ferguson, Missouri. So in Ferguson, Missouri, 2014-15 is when Michael Brown got shot, and the officer was not indicted, and we didn't know what happened. There was a bunch of other things happening during that summer as well. So it was kind of like a summer that we just had. And I wrote that I believe in both and. I believe it should be possible for Blacks and whites to live together peaceably in the same small town. And I believe that any town, talking about Ferguson, Missouri, that is 2/3 Black and has a police force, or this could be Brunswick, Georgia, that is 94% white, is more likely to have a race problem that erupts in violence. Both can be true. I believe it must be very difficult for white cops to maintain order in a predominantly Black town without some legitimate police work being perceived as racially motivated. And I believe it's likely that sometimes police work is racially motivated and biased. Both can be true at the same time. It's not popular, but it's true. I believe that white people look at law enforcement and assume it is good based on their experiences and interactions with the police. And I believe that Black people look at law enforcement and assume, based on patterns and legitimate history and personal experience, that someone is out to get them. I believe both can be true. So I'll go on and talk about, you name the issue when it comes to race. There are legitimate reasons for everybody to kind of believe what they believe, but we need to be willing to listen. We need to be willing to lament, to love, to hear another side, and know that you might be wrong. Yeah. And be okay with that. If you're trying to do things for the greater good, there should be a willingness there to hear both sides of it and to hear some of the facts that may not be popular with your circle. And another thing along those lines that we've talked about a lot, it may cost you something. And so if you're sitting here thinking, man, I really, want to step out and talk to some of my family members, some of my church members, some of my coworkers, some of the things they've said, some of the ways they've reacted, some of the things I know about them, I know it's not right. It may cost you some relationships that you have to decide if you're willing to lose. You have to count the cost. And there have been circles that we've been in before, churches we've been in before, other places where we know people aren't willing to give up the familial ties and the people that they eat with on the holidays and confront them and challenge them because of fear of being pushed out of that circle. Yeah. I will unite with anyone to do right and no one to do what's wrong. That's what Frederick Douglass said. And so we have to decide when it comes to this issue, are we willing to do what's right and what is it going to cost us?
That's good. Yeah. So, wow, that was really good. So I think we are going to kind of end on this last point about what do we do to create more inclusive spaces. I think Benjamin just spoke very, very well on this idea of counting the cost to be more inclusive. Like, what will it cost you? And again, take a breath. I think that we at first have to not be afraid when this conversation or situation comes up around race. I think that you're going to have a friend group that reflects what you really want, right? So it's very easy to be in a friend group that's very homogeneous and have the conversation around race, because you're all coming from very similar experiences. Like Benjamin mentioned, the just and how you maneuver the world is very different. I can't tell you over 2020 how many people called me and said, Kirsten, does this really happen to you? Like, why have you never told me? And so if you have someone, if you have friends that you're doing life with, people that you are making an effort for your kids to be around, for you to be around, so that when these issues around race come up, you have someone to help bring you back from whatever side you're on. You're like, okay, hold on. Let me think about this, like Benjamin said, in a critical way. Let me have someone I can talk this out. One of our dearest friends, when all this was happening, we simply text back and forth. We didn't really talk because we were in a situation, I was feeling like I couldn't say anything. Like there was just so much going on. It was so heavy. And I remember finally talking to our friends, husband and wife. And I just remember the conversation was like, I don't understand everything that you're saying. I've never seen it, or I don't have like, I don't have like an example of being in it, but because we love you, it matters to us. And I think at the end of that, got off that call and was just crying, because it's just the fact of being heard. Maybe you don't understand. Maybe you have nothing in your life to like stick this to. Like it just comes and it just falls down. It just comes and it falls. But when you have people in your life that have experienced it, or may have experienced, or can explain it to you differently, then it's like, oh my God, maybe I don't understand, but I trust you. I love you. We love your kids. We love your family. I remember when we talked about, preparing why their kids need to have this race conversation. I just remember the dad going to the sons like, listen, if you hear anybody say anything about our boy, if you hear anyone say, he's like, I'm telling you, you can punch him in the face. I was like, whoa, no, not that, not that.
These are good Christian people, punching people in the face.
Yeah, but it's just like he took it serious. He's like, no, my kids need to know this, because if they see somebody saying something to one of your girls, or saying a name like that to your boys, like he has permission, Kirsten. And I'm like, okay, yes, I love, but it's just like we were doing life together. And when you do life with people who look different than you, with different ethnicities, it just creates an atmosphere where you understand more. So being intentional is one way that you help create inclusive spaces. Being intentional about who you're doing life with, who you're friends with, who your kids seeing you hang out with, helps. I mentioned earlier about looking at your bookcase. Like, what authors do you have? I mean, there are a ton of authors out there, right? But if everyone looks like you, we try to make sure like we have a different variety of people that, that we're reading, that our kids are reading. I always say, look at your Twitter and your IG. Why? Because we're on it all the time. We're seeing people, we're hearing their voices, we're hearing their perspectives. So just being mindful of that as well. Oh, I said, what programs are you watching? And what light are people who are not like you? Like if you're white, if you're like, how are Black people portrayed? And so it's being mindful of that. Like, if you're always watching a certain show that shows Black people in a certain way, then, it's like, that's a fake show, but I don't know, it kind of like seeps into you a certain way. If you're watching a news, station that always puts people of color or Black people in a certain light, that has effect on you. So just being mindful, being smart about what we're letting in through our eyes, through our books, through what we're listening to, and to what we're seeing.
Yeah, it affects all of us. What we see, what we listen to. I mean, we are the combination of the things that we hear, the things that we read, the things that we watch. And so being mindful, like Kirsten said, about those things affects everybody, no matter what your background is. Mm-hmm. A lot of times we talk about this issue. If you're Black, you talk about how white folks should look at things. If you're white, you talk about how Black folks should look at things. But we are all affected mm-hmm. by images. Yeah. Whether that supports a spirit of superiority and supremacy, or whether that supports a spirit of inferiority. We are all affected by that. And so, it really is a great study to see, the impact of these images coming through television and how they are portrayed to us and how they differ from the truth of our lived experiences or the experiences of someone else that we have done life with.
That's good. That's
Any
good.
questions?
Yeah.
We've been talking a lot. We
I
want to hear
know.
you talk, or kind of talk, on the Q&A. So we'll go check that out right now. Courtney Ayers, I guess your dad is on it. Hey, Watson 7.
Oh, wow.
My husband prepared for our first baby in July. New Dad's Playbook. So New Dad's Playbook was a book I wrote, kind of a what to expect when she's expecting for guys, because guys get no instruction on diapers and swaddling, or even how to love the mother of their child throughout the process. And so the New Dad's Playbook was written with that in mind. And that was actually the why not's idea, because the why was thinking, I don't know, I can't write no book about this stuff. And she's like, why not? Guys know nothing. So you need to write a book to help them where you messed up all the time.
Yeah.
So she says, did Kirsten have plans to write something around her perspective involving pregnancy and motherhood?
No, and I'm not.
Why not?
No, Courtney, seriously, I haven't thought about it, honestly, but I do think that I'm open to that option as well. I've actually talked about a little bit, y'all, I don't really do technology, but I have just started to try to get this Instagram thing. So people have asked me questions about raising kids. So I kind of put a little bit on there, but writing a book, I don't know. That's probably another conversation. We can have, if you have specific questions like that, just like DM me and then I'll help you. All right. Book recommendations to get and read with children about this conversation. There's kind of this new wave of books to talk about race with kids that's coming out. There's nothing that we've seen specifically that we've used with our kids, but I would just say any conversation you want to have, I would just, like I said, just be one day ahead. You can read an article or a book on your own and break it down to whatever age your kids are listening to, or because your kids are. So if you do want to talk about Rosa Parks or whatever, which is a story that many people know. I mean, it's like the one that happens most of the time in schools. It's having the conversation around, okay, now what happened? How do you think they make these people feel? Just asking those questions to help facilitate conversation. But as of now, like the books for the kids, we generally read stuff as adults, and then we kind of just.
Yeah. There's a friend of ours named Trillia Newbell. She's an author. She's coming out with a book called Creative God, Colorful Us. Creative God, Colorful Us. And it's a new book that's coming out, but basically it's talking about how God created us in his image, but he also created us with so many differences, obviously, with our backgrounds, our cultures, those sorts of things. And then there's also, if you look up, Kirsten mentioned African-American heroes, but there are children's books. There's a whole line of children's books. If you just Google kids books race, or kids books African-American heroes or something like that.
I forgot about that.
There's a whole line of books with that are written for kids. Even the characters, the heroes, it's kind of
cartoonish.
Cartoonish takes the character back to when they were a kid and they're telling their story. But we have several of those too, so that would be a good way to go.
I would just go on Amazon and start looking, and then get one, and then see how you like it. But there are a couple that with inventors. We did one where we did like a different inventor every week. There's one that talks about, this is, I think, a good one. How do you address persons engaged and engage in conversations about race when you're put on a shelf and told that you'd never be able to understand? Why engage if you're already relegated to the sidelines when trying to enter the theater of ideas of the possible? Okay, so this one is tough. And I think it's happening a lot. So here's this is the perspective I want you to remember, if whoever this was, and anyone else who feels like they can't talk about race because you are white, and they're like, you'll never understand or whatever. I think it's important to remember that we said this earlier, that we are always talking about race between each other, with our kids, because we are Black, right? So we talk about race a lot. Many Black people talk about race a lot because we are the minority in many situations. And so what happened this past summer when all the conversations were happening, I had a lot of white friends reaching out to me like, Kirsten, I want to talk about it. I want to talk about it. I got to a point where I couldn't talk anymore. One, because I'm always talking about it, but it's like now that they were ready to talk about it, like I was supposed to be super open and fresh. And so I think that it's not that, it depends on who you're talking to. Like I don't know the person or the group that told you this, but I just think it's just to be mindful that when you're entering in the conversation and the questions that you ask, it's very obvious from the very beginning of the conversation to know whether or not you've done any research. Like if you just want me to recount the times that I've been spoken against, or like if I've been discriminated, or I think I was in a race situation, if you just want me to retell those stories, it's actually very tough to do. It's traumatizing to relive the first time I was called the N-word, or like when I'm followed in the store or whatever. So to have somebody to redo that is very hurtful. And it's also, you have to also remember that the kind of questions you come into the conversation with. If you come in and saying, Kirsten, I really understand redlining and how that impacted, suburbia and this, that, and the other, you start talking, I'm like, oh, wow, okay. So we're having a different conversation. We're not having this baseline, does racism exist because we had a Black president? We're having a different conversation. And so I think it's important for you to do some research, have some things that you have specific questions on, and you've already read some things about it when you enter into the conversation. Like, and I think that's going to be different for whatever Black person you encounter or group that you encounter, but it's not that you don't have a place to have the conversation. It's just like, where are we starting in the conversation can be very tiring. I mean, that's just kind of the honest.
Yeah, and I would say, if it's important to you, you'll keep trying. Mm-hmm. Just because somebody says, if you're told, to your question, you're told you'll never be able to understand. The answer to that would be, you're exactly right, because there are some things that we can't understand. I don't understand everything that Kirsten goes through. I have a lot of empathy. I care a lot about her because and I love her. So I'm going to try to figure it out. I may not understand it, may not have happened to me, may not have happened to my family, but I sure can care. And so if you care about something, you will press through. That's the first obstacle. And so if it's important, I would say continue to get off the sidelines, do some research, figure some things out, come back to the conversation with a little bit of an understanding, but also knowing that, you won't, simply because you don't experience something yourself doesn't mean it's not important. Yeah. Maturity comes from caring about things that you likely will never have to go through.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Let's see. Ben and Kirsten, listen to a few of your podcasts. You two generate amazing positive energy. The subjects are so challenging and relevant. I was wondering, how do you make your message relatable for non-Christians and keep it inspiring?
Well, I think some things are universal. Mm-hmm. I mean, from a biblical perspective, obviously the Bible talks about pretty much everything that we go through, from marriage to parenting, having kids, even, in the book of James talks about race and favoritism, all those things that we're talking about right now have a biblical component and biblical advice to it. But many things people are concerned about, whether they are Christians, Muslims, non-believers, or what, being a good dad. A lot of people care about that. I remember sitting over in Syria in a refugee camp. I was in Lebanon with a Syrian refugee family in a camp. I did not speak their language. I was not their religion. We're communicating through an interpreter. And the dad was sitting there. And as a father myself, I was able to encourage him as a father because he simply wanted the best for his kids. So he took his kids out of war in Syria in the middle of the night and was living in a tent settlement because he wanted what was best for his kids. And so talking about things like parenting or marriage or community or addressing the issues of our day with our children or challenging, there are sports, there are so many different things that we can talk about. And as believers, obviously, we go to scripture for our instruction on it. Mm-hmm. But these things are universal. That's why I think that, we've gotten some great feedback from a lot of people, and we appreciate you, offering that to us as well.
And listening. Okay, I want my peach kids to be confident to speak up for their brown friends. What should I tell them to say? Is stop it, that's wrong, enough. That's a great start, I think. But I mean, a lot goes into that, right? I think you have to think about, how old are the kids? What was said? We always tell our kids, tell the authority, the person who's in charge, telling a teacher. I think there's a whole line of things that can happen as a result of that. But I think the fact that even that, your peach kid has brown friends and they recognize, it would be the same thing as if, somebody was being, mean because they were a girl, or they, it's like just having, I think the idea of speaking up when they see something is important. Yeah.
Speaking up, speaking out. It talks about in Proverbs, speaking up for those who don't have a voice. And so that's something we should teach our kids regardless, outside of this issue, on any issue. Would you be willing to share your opinions on removing or not removing Confederate statues? This has been a hot topic for several years now, and it's one that, I don't think is going anywhere, although many of the statues have been taken down. My opinion with that has always been, again, from a historical perspective, understanding what many of these statues, not all of them, were set up to do. Many of the statues of Confederate leaders were set up in a time when Black Americans were fighting to get certain civil rights. They were done as a response or a reminder of their place in society. And so when you have people who have seen those statues been erected and they're still living, or their grandkids or their kids are still living, not grandkids, but kids, they're reminded every time they see that statue, although laws have changed, this is what we erected that statue to tell you about yourself. Do I think that every statue needs to come down? No. I think that municipalities need to vote if a statue comes down or changes. We change statues all the time. At some point, 100 years from now, a lot of things are going to be different about this place. And so that needs to be a collective decision. Do I think that statues are the answer to the race issue in the country? No, not at all. Taking down a statue or erecting a statue is not going to change the human heart. It's also not going to change so many other issues that we've talked about that are still being perpetuated in our country on a subconscious level. That is not overt, racism, these things that are happening. And so, I have a very nuanced view of statues. I'm not all in or all out, but I don't think they solve the problem, the overarching problem that we're talking about.
That's good. All right, my questions for Ben is the following. Did you ever experience anything in NFL locker room that just did not sit well with you, that led you to stand up and say something about how their actions were wrong, coaches, players, or staff? Also want to thank you so much for the time you both have taken today to speak with us. It's been powerful. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I feel like we're back home, and we are moving to Georgia next year. So
yeah. So if y'all have
anybody that's in Georgia,
babysitters, jobs, we need all of it. So it'll be great. There have been some experiences in NFL locker rooms, and specifically, I can remember times when I've had to confront coaches, not because I felt like they were being overtly malicious or intentionally malicious, but just like so many other things, there's a baked in culture sometimes of terminology that is not right, that is racist, and even if someone says something about players who largely are Black players, and they don't think they're doing anything that is malicious, you can hear that and you know where that's coming from. And so sometimes they just need to be, it needs to be addressed. And for the most part, the thing I do love about the culture of football, at least in my experience, has been when those things have been pointed out, many times there is a spirit of humility and contrition and understanding that you may not see outside of it. So look, football locker rooms, just like boardrooms, are not, absent of everything else that affects us in culture. But I do appreciate the willingness of people to stand up against it. Great. All right. Black Lives Matter has become so politicized, leading to a lot of division and strife among people. Can you provide your perspective on the Black Lives Matter movement? Okay, I'll start with this one because this is generally, especially we talk about being Christians, and sometimes people will say, well, Kirsten, I would support Black Lives Matter, but they have this X, Y, and Z parts that I just can't stand behind. And I just remind them, like, before this whole thing, it's been a movement for a minute, but before, when it first came out as a saying, it was in response to something. And the response was not that they couldn't get behind the movement. The response was, no, all lives matter. And so when we think back to when it was first said, it was a cry out to a group of people that felt and feels as though they were getting targeted in a particular way. And so it was just a reminder that Black lives do matter. Do I believe that? Absolutely. Do I believe when it was being said, it was talking specifically about that? Absolutely. Do I believe that it's been changed to to something else? It has grown and it is morphed into something else? Sure. In terms of the movement, I've got to be honest, I've never been on their website. I mean, that's just the truth, because when it came, the phrase for me personally is where I was able to understand, stop, take a breath, and be like, yeah, I agree with that. Black lives do matter. It's kind of like, I always hear the thing, like, if we have a whole street and one house is on fire, we don't say, well, all the houses matter. No, the one that's on fire is the one we're trying to address. And so for me, that statement was the one I can get behind. Okay, so in terms of the movement and how do I feel about the movement? I think sometimes for white people, speaking candidly, it's easier to say that the movement is so divisive, so I don't believe it, rather than just taking it for what it was. Because if we remember, it wasn't necessarily against the movement, it was actually against the statement. And with the rebuttal being the all lives matter, it felt like we were being unheard. And so I feel like the division and strife is that. It was, where do you fall with believing the statement? If you want to talk about the movement, that's something else, but I felt like it wasn't heard when the statement was being made.
Yeah, ditto. I'll just add that, you mentioned, Rachel, in the question that it's become so politicized. Mm-hmm. And, race has political connotations. Race was created through government and through legislation. That's how you got residential segregation. That's how you got those men fighting overseas only to come back and not get a loan for their homes. That's how that wealth was built. And so there are politics connected to it. And so when you attack racism or supremacy, white supremacy in this country, there has to be a political component as well as an individual and personal component. Mm-hmm. There has to be both. And so with Black Lives Matter, that was, I believe, started after Ferguson. And there are a lot of things that the organization states on their website that I personally don't agree with. There are a lot of things that I do agree with on their website. But an overarching thing is the fact that we even have to say, that someone has to even say or create an organization that says Black Lives Matter should lead us to say, why are you saying that? Why would you even have to say that? Mm-hmm. What has happened to make you think Black lives don't matter? And we can all agree that at some point, so for some of us, we think it was yesterday. For some of us, we think it was 1865. At some point, Black lives didn't matter in this country. Mm-hmm. Many of us think that it's okay now. Some of us don't. But what I'm saying is that we can all agree that at some point they didn't matter. So to have to say that, I think is again, going back to the idea of the outcry and to ask the question, why? Mm-hmm. And if someone says Black lives matter, the answer could be, yeah, yes, they do.
Mm-hmm. For sure. One of the things that I saw, I can't find it now, but they talked about, you mentioned James and where it talked about race in James. And I just want to, I think we were talking about the word Benjamin uses, partiality. So in James 2, it talks about not having partiality, or not showing partiality towards certain groups. He specifically talks about rich and poor. And so that's where, when we think about even partiality to who we like and don't like, how that's, so I don't know, it was there and now I don't see it. But James 2, for anyone who's asking about where in James that is. Okay, last one. Many of us grew up in a time where pretending to be colorblind was the way. As parents, how can we be better role models to see and appreciate differences? It sometimes feels like a fine line between admiration, appreciation, and appropriation. Would love your thoughts.
That's good.
That is good. Yeah, I do think it was at one point to say that we are all colorblind. That was like the politically correct, make you feel good kind of way to maneuver life. Like I don't see color. But I'm always a big proponent of telling the truth. Like thinking about what I say and then saying like, what does that really mean? Like, what am I really trying to say? I'm trying to say that I don't like one person over the other. And so I think the way we do that is having like when it says being better role models, to appreciate differences, is, again, goes back to that, like, why did I say that? And what comfort did that give me, knowing that I said that? And did I really believe it? And again, I think that's how we become better role models, is we admit when we've been wrong and we change. Like, you pivot to do something different. Like for us, it's like, okay, we admit that we were wrong and then we repent. We turn around and we go the opposite way. And I think we live in a culture where you call it the cancel culture. You make a mistake and you're done. So what ends up happening is people don't want to admit that they're wrong. They just get found out that they were doing wrong. So no one comes out and says, I was totally wrong on this. Like, I shouldn't have done it. I shouldn't have said it. I shouldn't have thought that way. I know something different now. And I think we would have, be very refreshing to see more people admit that the way they were thinking, that they've grown from thinking one way. And I think that's how we become better role models. The ones I want for my kids, or what I try to model to them, is that I don't get everything right. And just because I grew up thinking that this was the way I was supposed to parent doesn't necessarily mean that's the right way I should parent. And so like I made a mistake here, and that makes our relationship closer, because they're able to see that I'm willing to admit that I was wrong, and that I'm trying to do something different. And I think that helps us be better role models when we can be honest that we don't have all the answers. And it's possible that I could be wrong. I think that honesty opens up relationship and brings people closer. I don't know if that answers it completely.
Yeah, the one part where you mentioned, Leslie, about there being a fine line between admiration, appreciation, and appropriation. I think that's a very specific question, and there is a line there, but I think that line is developed through an understanding with the people who you are appreciating or appropriating, to understand where that line is. But also, I think that when it comes to appreciating culture, that's going to take work, because multiple cultures are not offered to us readily in their complexities. It takes us having to do some digging and looking and learning. And so when you do that, that's when you're able to appreciate more, and that's when you realize what Kirsten said about being colorblind is in some ways offensive, because it is in effect saying that I don't see your color, but your color really is more than just your color. It's your culture. It's your history. Mm-hmm. It's why you see things the way you see things. I'm not colorblind. I know European history. It's been taught to me. I know American history. It's been taught to me, all those things. And so it's more difficult, I think, to learn something outside of that. But the hope is that, we'll be willing to say, you know what? I see your color. I see your culture. I want to learn more about it. I don't think yours is better than mine, but also I don't think mine is better than yours.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for your time. It's right there at a minute. I think we're right at 2:15.
I know you got to go back to work.
Got to go back to work. Thank you so much for having us, and we'll pass it on to Dean Ayers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten and Benjamin. Thank you for joining us today and for your honesty and openness and encouragement. We are incredibly proud of you and thankful for you. All of us on today, look for a follow-up email from the event that will contain some of the resources that Kirsten and Benjamin mentioned today. And then also we'll share our next virtual opportunities to connect in the Terry Alumni newsletter that is sent out monthly. Do encourage you all to follow the Terry Alumni on Facebook, on Instagram, and on LinkedIn to stay connected and get the latest updates on upcoming events. And my hope for all of us is to have a wonderful holiday season, and of course, go Dogs.
Go Dogs.
Go Dogs.